Perfect. Excellent. So it's been a couple of weeks. Great to see all of you back. I assume a good chunk of you were here 2 weeks ago when I spoke briefly, but we then had the privilege to listen to the folks from Yamam. I thought that was a really neat treat, but now it's my turn again. So in the schedule, this course was supposed to be about tension between the religious and secular communities in Israel, in the diaspora, what Israel can learn from the United States as far as religious pluralism, what the United States might be able to learn from Israel in terms of how it's been able to deal with the religious-secular divide. Is the chasm growing? Yes, in many respects. Is it narrowing in some respects? It is. But the previous class dedicated to the history of the economy in Israel, I think, deserves sort of a full, robust hour, and we didn't have the opportunity to really dissect what the Israeli economy has gone through, how it's transformed, where it is, and what potentially lies ahead. So my trick for this afternoon will be to combine both themes and see how one can look at some of the challenges that we have, particularly in Israel, and look at some of the opportunities we have, particularly in Israel, regarding the economy. So I'm going to focus on the economy and talk about the history and add some personal reflections. I mean, I told you the jokes last time about the agronomist, the Israeli agronomist who sort of showed up the Texan by saying, my car was a bad car, and then now you've got a prouder version of humor talking about the economy. Israel thinks that, well, if you don't find anything, that means it proves that we had wireless communication thousands of years ago. The starting point for us will be, and for those of you who were here last year when we talked about the story of Israel, went through the history, we really started to get into more detail in the 1880s after the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, the pogroms, and Aliyah Aleph in 1882. And that's when, in meaningful numbers relative to what had been taking place centuries earlier, meaningful numbers, you had a return of Jews to Zion. So they started building communities. They got some payments from abroad. Montefiore and Rothschild, probably two of the more famous benefactors of the early Yishuv. But it was a very basic subsistence economy, but enough to also motivate a lot of Arab immigration. The land was generally barren. It wasn't just the Jews weren't living there, hardly anybody was living there. And there are famous quotes by Mark Twain and other people who visited and reflected on how sad it was that this holy land had become so desolate. But the Jewish immigration to then called Palestine brought a lot of people from the periphery to work in mostly construction, but also basic commerce. And you'll see that construction and agriculture are the two areas in particular where there was cooperation among Jews and non-Jews living in the territory. After World War I, the First War, a third of the Jews then living in Israel actually left. So there are a lot of people, maybe even people in this room, who were born in the United States or Canada, but whose parents may have lived in what is now Israel in the 1920s and 30s. But there was a modest migration out, but the population actually never really declined because more people, never declined precipitously, because more people were coming in the 20s and 30s. Two big events, obviously, were the immigration quotas in the United States in the early 20s, and the increasing hostility against Jews in Europe in the 1930s. So that started a much more bustling economy. There were very compelling and impressive, think about it, this is built on socialism. So when we think about the Israeli economy in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, you think of the, Mapai, Mapam, socialist mindset of Ben-Gurion, Katznelson, Ben-Tzvi, and that's what it was. It was extremely equal in terms of incomes, low, but not a lot of variability, and a tremendous emphasis on agriculture. So sometimes when I give a class on the Israeli economy, I'll walk in with an orange. I can't really find a Jaffa orange. You tell me where to buy them. And I know we still export Jaffa oranges, and I know they're still tasty, but I just can't seem to find one anywhere. But that was the symbol of the Israeli export economy. Now I don't think people would even know that they do that. But if you read any book, I mean, Ari Shavit gives a lot of attention to this in his book. The orange groves and the orchards, Paldisim. And that's what Israel sort of said. This is the new Jew. This is the new Sabra. We are going to come to this fertile land from the shtetls, from the Pale of Settlement. We're going to take advantage of the ability to really cultivate an impressive array, and we're going to be independent. Right? If you think about it, we'll get to the end of the lecture, and we'll talk about natural gas, and we'll talk about water. The ability to be independent from a food standpoint is a very key national security interest. Israel didn't really have that option. I mean, I'll repeat what I said very briefly when I had a chance 2 weeks ago. Israel is an island economically. If you look at its neighbors, right, normally an economy develops by cultivating trade relations with your immediate neighbors. Right? If you look at Israel's neighbors, Israel might as well be on another planet, right? Lebanon, Syria. We have peace treaties with Jordan and Egypt, and there's some trade, but it was mostly us buying some gas from Egypt and us exporting water to Jordan. There was a little bit of work done in the textile industry. I'll talk about that in the 1990s after the peace treaty with Jordan was signed. But regional trade was not an option. It wasn't then, and it really isn't now. The Middle East, by the way, just so you should know, among regions in the world, taking Israel outside of the equation, has the lowest incidence of intra-regional trade. These countries tend not to trade very much with each other. Some are poorer than others, but there isn't really, you think about commerce and free trade agreements in other parts of the world. I mean, Europe most famously, but you've got Mercosur in Latin America, you have ASEAN in the Far East. The other countries in the Middle East haven't been as aggressive in developing these kinds of commercial ties with one another, and certainly not with Israel. But now, suddenly, Israel in 1948-49 has to assume its own economic independence. So we have a state. The institutions are no longer run by the British mandate, and it's a credit, I think, to Israel and the leadership of the population at the time that they turned whatever institutions, whatever civic institutions that the British had been using, into the civic institutions of the new Israeli government. And that infrastructure was already in place. So now what do you do? Now remember, we talked about Israel doubling in size from 1949 to 1952. So this is a massive, to tie the first class into this class, there's a massive economic burden with no resources. Israel had no foreign currency reserves, didn't really have anything that it could sell to anybody else. It was a very, very state-controlled economy, massively. I mean, even for a socialist country, the government's intervention into pretty much every aspect of the country's economy was very high. And German reparations played a very big role. We don't really like to talk about it, but they played a massive role in allowing the Deutschmark then. So we had Deutschmarks from Germany for reparations, and we had Israel bonds played a meaningful role. The United States, and we'll talk about that in the next class, we'll talk about the political relationship between the United States and Israel throughout the 12 presidencies and 12 prime ministers that coincidentally have been in the United States and Israel respectively since 1948, did not sell any military equipment to Israel in the 40s and 50s. Some defensive missiles, Hawk missiles, were sold to the Middle East in the Kennedy administration in the early 60s, and then Johnson was the first to really embark on a military relationship. But the United States did give Israel in the 1950s, during what was called Tkufat HaTzena, the austerity period, a lot of agricultural surpluses. So at that time, Israel still self-sufficient in food, but didn't have as much in the way of grain and other needs in order to feed twice as many people as it had to feed in 1948. So that was a big deal. And it helped. You know, we talked about jokes, so this was a joke that was told when Pinchas Sapir was he was the Minister of Finance for a very, very long time. And people weren't, you know, you think about Israeli politicians today, I think the joke actually resonates better today than it did in the 1950s. But the joke was they went to an elementary school and they saw that the school was completely dilapidated. They, you know, the classrooms were run down, and the principal said, we have no money, and we need to fix this. And the government said, we have no money either. We don't have resources. Sorry, we can't help you. Then we went to the universities, and similarly, you know, the facilities were worn down, and the classrooms and the equipment was really outdated, and the principal of the university, president of the university, said, you got to help us. The Prime Minister said, I'm sorry, we just have no money. And then they went to the prisons, and the prisons were in equally bad shape, and said, we need to allocate 50 million shekels immediately to improve the prisons. So I asked him, but why? He says, look, we've already done with grade school. I don't think any of us are going to university anymore, but who knows which one of us will wind up in prison. So now the joke is that when one Israeli politician asks another for their cell number, they're not really talking about their phones. But coming back to the 1950s, 60s, by the way, there's seats up front. If anybody's sort of coming in a little late, there are quite a few seats up here. So I worked for a company called Core Industries. So I was very privileged to work for Core Industries for 6 years, from 1995 to 2001. And I'm going to use Core Industries as the paradigm of what the Israeli economy was like. Core was established in 1944 as it was really a part of the Histadrut, the trade union that controlled the Israeli economy, and it was a repository for immigrants coming into Israel. Now remember, we're talking about an economy that was isolated and insular, and really Core made everything. It was a holding company, but it had a wig company and a newspaper company and a textile company and a food company and a building materials company, so that whether it was a cement plant or the steel facility or the electronics or pharmaceuticals, Core owned most of Teva for a long time. So and Tadiran and Telrad and Osem and so many different food companies and transportation companies were in one way or another controlled by the trade union. And this wasn't a profit-oriented objective. What you wanted is you wanted employment. That was key. People need to be part of the economy. And votes. Right? I mean, I remember I got there in 1995, and it was so cute. People would still stamp their cards. And this is corporate headquarters, right? You still stamp your cards. You get a tlush, a voucher for your meals. You go downstairs, you get a voucher for your meals, and then you get, because it had an affiliation with the co-op, before the major holidays, you get a certain amount of vouchers where you can go in and buy, whether it's matzah or hamantashes or you know, chanukiyot. I found it was charming, but it was really, basically, you controlled the employee from the moment he walks in the door to the moment he gets his pension, and that could be a 20-year gap, but that was really very emblematic of the way the Israeli economy was in the 50s, 60s. The Israeli economy grew, so the growth rates from a very low base up until the Six-Day War were impressive. From the Six-Day War to the Yom Kippur War, they were massive, because you now had this much larger population base. But the exports were light, and fiscal policy, there's some seats up front, by the way, fiscal policy was erratic. And when we think, all of us in the room are probably old enough to remember thinking of Israel as a fairly impoverished country. And the relationship certainly was, you know, what can we get from America? What can we get from Europe? It didn't have, certainly as far as fiscal responsibility, monetary policy, it didn't have what we would call cutting-edge thinkers running those institutions. And the shekel kept getting devalued once it was released from its peg in the 1970s. And inflation was rampant. up until through 1985. At some point, it was like 400% inflation. We have at least one Venezuelan in the room. You can relate to that. You don't know what to do with your money because tomorrow, who knows how much it's going to be worth. And the whole concept was one of let's hope things will be okay. And a lot of constraints, a lot of controls. Rabin famously resigned his position as prime minister in 1977 because his wife Leah had an offshore bank account. You weren't allowed to hold money outside the country because the fear was that if they let you hold any money outside the country, you'd export all of your money outside the country because nobody had confidence in the fiscal institutions in Israel. And frankly, we talked about the Israeli economy being an island, so there were certain places we could export to. There was some export relationship with the United States. There wasn't a full-blown free trade agreement since the 1960s. But there wasn't, aside from agriculture and diamonds, people don't think about it a lot, but diamonds are a very big component even today. Polished diamonds, a very, very large component of the Israeli economy. Israel's third largest trading partner, believe it or not, is Belgium, after the United States and China, because of the diamond trade. So the big transformation took place in the 1980s when finally they said, we're going to control inflation, we're going to modernize our economy, we're going to treat the central bank seriously, and it's not just sort of a slush fund, a long arm, it's going to be an independent central bank. And Core was on the brink of bankruptcy in 1990, famously, because they just couldn't pay their debts. They were borrowing and borrowing and borrowing and borrowing. They were borrowing mostly from Israeli banks, and so the Israeli banks certainly weren't going to put them out of business, but they also borrowed from Bankers Trust. And they borrowed from other non-US institutions that were willing to lend money, and then suddenly said, well, look, you got to pay us back. And they had a massive debt-to-equity swap, so the larger shareholders of Core Industries in the late 80s went from the Histadrut owning everything to owning 23%, and the other big and discount bank, because they got their equity and they enabled the other non-Israeli debt holders to get paid off. So now what happens in the 1980s is you have a saner economic system, and now the good times start. Because as we get to the end of that decade, a couple things happen simultaneously. One, in the 1990s already, the walls to emigration from the Soviet Union come down. So during one decade, Israel receives approximately 1 million immigrants from the former Soviet Union. That is a massive number. It's larger in terms of absolute numbers than what we experienced in the early 50s. And it's a very high quality immigration. So not everybody found a professional home in their previous vocation, but a lot of them did. And you had an influx of engineers who were able immediately to find meaningful work in some of the industries, particularly some of the defense industries. And they also lit a fire under the you-know-what of the legacy workers who may have been taking it easy, but now their own productivity is going to be under greater scrutiny because we have options. It was a game changer. So were the U.S. loan guarantees. For those of us who remember the administration of Bush Sr. and Secretary Baker's famous comments about how generous we ought to be to the Jews who don't vote Republican, at the end of the day, there was and we'll talk about this in the next class, by the way, the relationship between Bush Sr. and Shamir did have an impact on the Israeli mindset when they went to the polls in 1992. The result of that election was that Yitzhak Rabin became the next prime minister again after 1977. So the loan guarantees enabled Israel to borrow money, which it wasn't able to do. It relied on Israel bonds. The German reparations became a decreasingly relevant or increasingly irrelevant component of Israel's GDP. But we were able to piggyback off America's credit rating, which was great, because that's a sane level of interest rates that you can afford to service. And frankly, the peace process. So wherever you are on the political spectrum, whatever you think of Oslo as a strategic decision from a geopolitical standpoint, it did change the way many countries felt about Israel as a place where they can do business. And even more meaningfully, after the peace with Jordan in 1994, people who were never thinking about doing business with Israel, who were either directly or indirectly supporting the secondary or tertiary Arab boycotts, so only the Arabs supported the primary boycott. But you have, look, we talked about this, if you were in Israel in the 1990s or 1980s, up until 94, no Japanese cars except for Subarus, no Pepsi, just Coke. I mean, there were major multinational companies who just said, this is off our radar screen. And that changed. It changed drastically, it changed massively, and it exposed Israel to so many additional trading partners. India is a huge trading partner now for Israel. Their new head of state, Modi's a great guy. He came to Israel when he was the governor of his state. Prime Minister Netanyahu has been over there to visit him. India is, I think, already and in the future, tremendous potential. I mean, perhaps even close to what Israel's been able to do with China for the past 20 years. But Israel wasn't doing much with China 25 years ago. It wasn't doing anything with India. It didn't have trade relations with India until the mid-90s. This enabled it to happen. I'll tell you one little anecdote. I literally, maybe my third day at work at Core Industries, I'm the assistant to the president and CEO, and he had an office manager, and she'd been with him for a long time, and they had a special relationship, and I don't think she was extremely excited about me getting hired. But we had a visiting delegation from Korea, right, one of the Kariatsu. Kariatsu from Japan. But the Kariatsu from Japan, these are the conglomerates of Japan, and the Chaebols are the conglomerates from Korea. One of them, and a big one, it might have been like Samsung or LG, is coming. We have this fancy boardroom overlooking the Mediterranean Sea, and we have the corporate brochures on all the tables, and she's there making sure that everybody has a little piece of cake and a little brochure, and there's a flag in front of all these tables, and I'm running around the thing taking all the flags off. And she was yelling at me, you can't do that. I said, I'll talk to you about it later. She said, I'm going to fire you. You can fire me. But I'm just taking all the flags off the table, and I managed to throw them in a closet right before they came off the elevator into the conference room, because they were the flags of North Korea. So we're just sort of getting used to each other, right? It was a process. But my first business trip as a businessman for this company, as the assistant to the president and CEO, was to Amman, Jordan. I mean, it was very interesting. You know, I was actually born in Israel, and the Israeli government, the Canadian government, but I have Canadian citizenship, and the Canadian government, actually, David Berger was the ambassador at the time, and he arranged to issue a passport with my place of birth erased. So that made it a lot easier for me to travel, ultimately to Saudi Arabia, Dubai, Abu Dhabi. But remember what we're talking about now, 94, 95, 96, 97. This was a period of tremendous curiosity. We were very curious. I mean, I think the Israelis overdid it, but the World Economic Forum had their first Middle Eastern conference in Casablanca in 1994, where Israeli and non-Israeli businessmen were able to interact with each other. And I think there were 400 people at the conference in Casablanca. I wasn't at that one, but over 300 of those 400 were Israelis. So I think it sent the wrong message. We were a little bit too eager. Other people felt overwhelmed. But it was this kind of enthusiasm. It was after being forced to be on the sidelines for such a long time and now being included that really transformed the Israeli mindset. And Israelis always loved to travel. There were some places they couldn't go to that now they were able to go to. And they took advantage of it. And invariably, you'll meet some people on your trip, and then you'll come back and you feel like you know Thailand, or you know Vietnam, or you know Burma, or you know China, and then you want to go back in whatever capacity, increasingly now in the mid-late 90s in high-tech, and go there. When I was invited as a guest of the Saudis, because Core Industries, remember, we had over 100 subsidiaries, so we had a nearly limitless menu of options if people wanted to think about strategic partnerships. And in the rest of the Middle East, in Jordan in particular, but in the rest of the Middle East, they were under enormous pressure to diversify their economies. Oil was trading at $10, $12 a barrel. And you know, now it's come down a lot too, but up until 6 months ago, the petro economies were just chugging along. Then they wanted to get to learn about advanced agriculture, telecommunications, the mythology, the mystique of Israeli technology had already started to run its course. And we're very good. We'll talk a little bit about what it means to boycott Israel. But we're not as good as we think we are, and we're certainly not as good as they think we are. But that's okay. We're not in the business of bursting their bubbles. And we benefit a lot from that perception. And it was interesting, but it was clandestine, it was secret. People were not yet prepared to let you in, embrace you. I had our New York address on our business cards, so could have an Israeli address. In Jordan, it was a little bit different, but still a little scary sometimes. I was actually in Jordan when the Mossad tried to kill Khalid Mashal. I don't know if you guys remember this. He was injected with poison, and the king went to the prime minister, said, if you don't give us the antidote, then you know, the peace treaty's over. And look, to the Mossad's credit, they knew who to go after. For those of you who've been following the news for the past 17 years since that happened, Khalid Mashal is the head of the military wing of Hamas. And certainly somebody we'd be a lot better off without. But it was probably not the best choice of where and how you'd want to get rid of him. But the Jordanian people, or let me say the Jordanian business community, right, which is a much narrower niche than the Jordanian people, were very receptive. And they were proud, and I think that whether you're looking at it from a commercial standpoint or from a peace standpoint, this idea of dignity is critical. But they really wanted to be partners with Israelis. So we put together some greenhouses to grow tomatoes and melons, and we had a battery facility up in Irbid. For those of you who know, it's like opposite Beit Shan. It's like their industrial area in the northern part. We had a modest textile cooperation with them, but Dov Lautman, who was a tremendous industrialist from Delta and a real visionary as far as cultivating relationships. By the way, the Israeli, until high tech, the textiles were Israel's biggest sort of non-diamond manufacturing component, but then obviously labor became more expensive in Israel, much less expensive in the Far East, so that all was moved off. Jordan looked like a good place to do it. Cheap, well-educated workforce, a lot of engineers, but the political barriers were still there. So the stigma of working with an Israeli company was real. And interestingly enough, the farther you moved from Israel's borders, the less vitriolic. I don't read Arabic, but if I read the English language newspapers in Amman and Cairo, countries with which we do have formal peace treaties, they're much harsher towards Israel. So the animus expressed in the op-eds and the cartoons is greater, ironically, the closer you are. If you go farther afield, you go to Dubai, you go to Abu Dhabi, you go to Bahrain, you go to Saudi Arabia, they'll write a lot about Israel. It's not just the New York Times that's obsessed with us. The amazing thing, but they'll write about ECI Telecom, they'll write about Teva, they'll write about Checkpoint. Not necessarily with admiration, but the Israeli companies seem to get a disproportionate amount of attention. The op-eds, the political op-eds are hostile, but they're not as hateful. I mean, if you read the English language press in Amman or Cairo, certainly in the 1990s, when I was spending more time there, it was not nice. But what was happening at the same time is we didn't really need that. We were now opening all these other doors. So while my boss, Benny Gaon, was born in Israel in 1935, he celebrated his bar mitzvah in 1948. He comes from a Sephardic background. He felt that his role is very close with Prime Minister Rabin, but he felt that his goal was to build these commercial bridges to peace. He was tripping all over himself to try to host any Jordanian, any Egyptian. He would fly anywhere to meet any Saudi or anyone else from the broader Middle East who could engage in a serious discussion about commercial relations. It was, you know, in his heart and his soul. But it wasn't so much in theirs, and at the end of the day, he's also the president and CEO of a large industrial complex, and shareholders wanted to focus on those companies and those markets and those industries where profit potential was much more meaningful, and it wasn't in our region. The tech sector, when people talk about Israel, I'm going to give you a few statistics now because I think it's important to highlight. Israel invests 4.5% of its GDP in research and development. The OECD is the Organization of Economically Developed Countries, but Israel joined in May of 2010, so these are all the rich countries that you can think of, about the 25 richest countries in the world, and Israel is one of them. And the average in the OECD is 2.3%. So that means Israel invests, and next to Israel is South Korea, they're about 4.2 or 4.3, but the average is 2.3. So this impressive statistic would lead us to conclude that Israel's investment in R&D is nearly twice the average of the OECD. But it gets better, because this is just civilian investment in research and development. When you think about great laboratories of science in the world, you think of MIT, you think of Caltech, you think of Stanford. But in my view, the biggest centers of research and development are the Israeli Army and the US Army. The Israeli Army accounts for 9% of Israel's GDP. The Yom Kippur War was 30%. And the amount of research, if you look, one of the things we're very proud of is that Israel has more startup companies than any other place but Silicon Valley, which is true. About 3,000 to 4,000 startup companies. Israel has, next to the United States and Canada, more companies listed on the NASDAQ than any other country. That's true too. But over half of those Israeli companies listed on the NASDAQ are based in whole or in part on military technologies that were then converted to civilian applications. And I think it's self-evident, right? Because if you think about the Army, you think about tanks and planes, and you need them, tanks, planes, submarines, but you also are working a lot on cybersecurity, huge deal now, electronic warfare, software developments. That's where the game changer for the Israeli technology sector took place, when the focus went from hardware to software. I mean, Tesla, which is one of my favorite companies, they have a very nice looking car, but you don't really need to worry so much about whether you're going to have features in the 2015 model that you didn't have in the 2014 model or 2013 model, because the upgrades are a disk. You get your disk, you put it in, and it's reprogrammed to know how to do all the stuff that the older version didn't know how to do. And that's cool. I don't know if it makes the tires last any longer or what it does to some of the other sort of hard components, but the guts of that miracle is the software. And that's true for most of the planes that you see in the sky and most of the tanks that you see on the ground. And that's where the Israel-US cooperation, which we'll talk about more next week, became very profound. I think this is where the United States started seeing Israel as an eye-level strategic partner. So again, if you come to APAC next month, or if you're involved in the Israel-US political discourse, you'll hear that despite some noise that's going on between Washington and Jerusalem, the relationship between the Pentagon and the IDF is extremely robust and extremely intimate, and that's true. And part of the reason is that it's really seen as a two-way relationship, and we'll get into the specifics of that next week. But, so, all this is happening, and this is a good thing. It's a good thing when you have a country where you'd have to go and bring Adidas running shoes for your cousin because they wouldn't be able to buy it, or there was no McDonald's anywhere. I'm not saying that McDonald's makes for a better society, but access to stuff makes you feel like you're among the privileged. If I have the choice to buy any car or any suit or eat, in a much broader range of restaurants, that makes me feel empowered. I no longer need to travel abroad. I can do that here. But if I do travel abroad, I now have an income because I started a company and I recruited strategic investments. One of the things that was great for us at Core Industries was that we were the largest menu in the country, and this was great for me personally because I was the assistant to the president and CEO of the company. But I was also 30, and I'd had a little career in New York as a corporate attorney and spent some time learning about the investment banking system. But I spoke English. And the migration of the language in the boardroom and the correspondence among all these strategic partners from Hebrew to English was not an easy one for a lot of these corporate executives. Suddenly, so Shamrock, the Disney holding company, I'm not sure Walt would have liked this very much, they wound up buying the Histadrut share. So 1995, it's about 7 months after I joined, 1995, there's no more Histadrut. We're no longer part of the trade union. So 50 years of union control over. We still had the unions, we still had to deal with the workers, and that was a variable challenge. But the Volvos and the Nortels and the Alcatels and all these major multinationals wanted to partner with Israeli companies, and they would be their foothold in the Middle East. We didn't have a lot of startups. We didn't have any startups. I mean, these were all legacy companies from before the creation of the modern state. But it set the example for what everybody now brags about. So you think of any major company, any major technology company. When I was supposed to give this lecture 2 weeks ago, I was going to talk about $900 million of foreign investment in Israel that was going to take place in the previous 2 weeks. It's true. Amazon bought a major company. Yesterday, Microsoft announced that it's buying a company for $200 million. These are big numbers. I mean, when Core Industries, this giant flagship, had its IPO, it was a $120 million IPO. It was unprecedented. It was the largest foreign capital raise ever. And that was almost 20 years ago. And it sort of reminds me, I don't know if you remember this, but the Austin Powers movie where they freeze this guy for 30 years, and suddenly, he's woken up. And the movie was in 1997, by the way. And then there's Dr. Evil, who tries to hold the whole world hostage. He says, I'm going to blow up the world unless you pay me $1 million. And they laugh at him, right? And $1 million may have been a lot when they froze you, but it's not a lot now. So then he says, okay, $100 billion. Everybody's shaking in their boots. Shaking in their boots. Now $100 billion is a rounding error on the budget of this country, right? I mean, QE3, they do that in a weekend. But at the time, it was a lot of money. Now you have like companies like Engine, that's the company that Microsoft bought for $200 million. It's a pen. Right? I mean, it's amazing that these things are happening. It's wonderful that they're happening in Israel. But Google, Amazon, Microsoft, eBay, Apple, all of these companies have acquired Israeli companies and have stayed in Israel and have turned these into their R&D centers, not their only R&D centers, but major R&D centers. It started with Intel. Intel in 1964 actually had their first foray into Israel. And then in the 1990s built a very large facility in Kiryat Gat, in Haifa. All of us, I assume, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but if you travel in Israel, it's not one location. When they call Israel Silicon Valley, right? It says Silicon Valley, it's Silicon Valley. Valley is the Arab word for valley, but it's used in colloquial Hebrew as well. So it's not just Tel Aviv, it's not just Herzliya, it's not just Ra'anana, it's not just Petach Tikva, it's not just Yokneam, it's not just Har Chotzvim, it's not just Malcha, it's not just Beersheba, it's Haifa, it's all of these places. So there are a dozen major clusters of high-tech innovation peppered around the country. I'm one of the board governors of Ben-Gurion University. We're now establishing the Cybersecurity Center of Israel in the Negev. The Israeli Army headquarters are moving from the Kiryat, which is right smack in downtown Tel Aviv, to Beersheba, to the Negev. So this is the things that Ben-Gurion himself pushed for in the 50s and 60s are now happening in a more natural way. But these are transformational days for the Israeli economy, but there are also some repercussions. And here's where I want to talk about who gets to participate in all this great stuff and who doesn't, and where the income inequalities have gone. There's a concept in economics called the Gini coefficient, right? It's It's a measure of the discrepancy between the haves and the have-nots. So the higher the number, the greater the discrepancy. So obviously if you have these despotic African countries where two people have all the wealth and nobody else shares them, so there you're going to have a very high Gini index. The United States has a pretty high Gini index among developed countries. Israel's is high. Is a lot higher than it should be. It's in the top tier. So if you went and Googled Gini coefficient, highest, best, worst, Israel would be among the highest or the worst. And it's a problem that is particularly segregated to certain demographic segments of society. Arab women and Haredi men barely participate in the economy of Israel. So if we look at those segments, and we can give you the numbers in a second, you have, of a population of slightly over 8 million people, you have nearly 20% Arabs. It's about 1.7 million Arabs. The Haredi population is a little bit harder to nail down because they're, it's how religious do you need to be to hop into the Haredi category? But it's about half of the Arab population. So it's about 700, more like 850,000. So about a tenth of the population. But it's 20% of the population under the age of 20, and 30% of the population under the age of 6. Over 50% of all kids in Jerusalem elementary schools are Haredi, and they're not getting, they're getting educated, but they're not getting a competitive education. And, hold on, we'll start.
And Arab. 50% of the Haredim and the Arabs are under.
Maybe nationwide, but I'm talking about in Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, there are certainly a lot of Arabs in Jerusalem too, but the Haredi birth rate is astounding. It's over 6 kids on average. It's about 6.5. So if you're lazy and you only have 5 kids, that means your neighbor's got to have 8. And if you're really lazy and you only have 3, that means your neighbor's got to have 11 or 10. So it's great. If you're interested in seeing a larger population in the state of Israel, it's wonderful. But it's scary if you think about what that means in terms of the burden on Israeli society if they're not going to participate meaningfully in the workforce. And there's some good signals. I mean, Benjamin Netanyahu is getting a lot of headlines today and yesterday, and he will tomorrow. And we'll talk about that next week in class because it's much more relevant to that topic. But he was Minister of Finance from 2003 to 2005. He was a pretty good Minister of Finance. And he would run around listening to anybody telling anybody who would listen, his favorite story from when he was in basic training. And I was a big swarthy guy in basic training, and we had this drill we had to do. They lined everybody up in a line, and you had to take the person next to you, put him on your shoulders, and run 100 meters. So I took the guy next to me, put him on my shoulders, and I ran 100 meters. Next to me there was this big burly guy. He had a little fellow next to him. He put him in, he sprinted 100 meters. Then you had a really small guy with a giant next to him, put him on his shoulders, took one step, and collapsed. And that's the Israeli economy. So and it was a very provocative story. I mean, I don't know if it was true. You figure it out based on what you think of him. But I think it was provocative, and it resonated because he cut back on a lot of these social welfare programs because he realized that the workforce participation rates were too low. Everybody talks about unemployment. Unemployment's gone to 7, unemployment's down to 5. But a much more meaningful, long-term metric is workforce participation, which means, for the non-economists in the room, how many people who are eligible to work are in the mix, either working or looking for work, right? Because the unemployment measure is the percentage of people who are looking for work who don't have a job. If you're not looking for work, the most educated, you look at matriculations, number of people who actually complete their high school matriculations, Christian Arabs actually poll higher than Jews. but they don't if you take the Haredi out of the question, out of the equation. So if you look at secular Jews or even the national religious Jews, then the matriculation rate of completion is higher than the Christian Arabs. But the numbers are too low across the board. Israel has a massive challenge. We talked about great R&D and the 4.5% of what's going on in the military, but the educational system in Israel right now is broken. And smart people are thinking about how best to fix it. But the inclusion of this growing Haredi population, whether, people can argue, do they have to go to the army? Should there be some sort of national service? Should Arabs be forced to do some sort of national service? Obviously from a security standpoint and maybe from a humane standpoint, you don't want to draft them into a situation where they may be firing weapons against their cousins or co-religionists in the event of a conflict, and that's beyond the scope of this discussion. But social cohesion is a national security interest. And that's sort of where economic issues sort of tie everything together. And if we don't have a way of integrating, and if we go back to Bibi's parable of having this massive burden on your back, I mean, the two parties that got the surprising number of votes in the 2013 election, Naftali Bennett's Habayit Yehudi and Yair Lapid's Yesh Atid, There's a Future, one thing they had in common, and they were like this until they weren't, but one thing that they had in common was Shivyon Banetel, sharing the burden. And Naftali Bennett walks around with a yarmulke, but he also served in Sayeret Matkal. So the idea of sharing the burden is really resonating. Next to we had the cottage cheese demonstrations in 2011, where people put their little tents on Rothschild Boulevard, which is sort of a very exclusive part of Tel Aviv, to demonstrate against these high prices and social and income inequalities. The Haredi are demonstrating sometimes violently against being drafted, and one needs to be sensitive to the things that they care most about. So personally, I promised I won't weigh in on my own personal issues or opinions, but their big claim is that they're doing as much in the service of the security of Israel by praying, because that's obviously the reason God looks out for us in a conflict, and they would be exposed to influences. So the first one I actually don't really think that most people would buy into. The second one is that it's corrupting. It's corrupting to be in an environment, it's corrupting and shocking when you've been so isolated and so secluded from the 20th and 21st centuries to then be tossed into an environment that really is a shock to the system, where you have boys and girls, men and women cavorting in a rather carefree spirit. That's not something that they've been trained for, that's not something that they want, that's not something they want their children to experience. It's really, so they have something called the Nachal HaCharedi, which is the sort of the stream to bring the ultra-Orthodox, like the vocational training centers in Beitar and Modi'in Elite for the Haredi women. It's optically important. It's not going to help Israel's national security. They're not doing the kinds of things that would be described as Shivyon Banetel, sharing the burden, but they're doing something, and that's cool. And I think that the leadership is a little better than it used to be, but there's a lot of room to improve. And I'll give you just some examples. If you served in the IDF as a Haredi person, you'd have a pretty tough time finding a wife. So now then they switched that. So they only served after they're already married. But after they're already married, they have other responsibilities. But you'd be completely ostracized. Because the fear would be in that, remember, very insular community that you've already been so corrupted, so contaminated by being in contact with that secular bastion of immorality that you're no longer fit for the rest of us. And it's a challenge. However, what we're seeing, and some major improvements that one ought to really recognize, and a couple of organizations, Zaka, and some of you are familiar with Zaka, those are the ultra-Orthodox who pick up the limbs after homicide bombings, after terrorist attacks. They're on the front lines making sure that the remains of those murdered in the aftermath of these attacks are treated halachically, properly, Another organization, Yad Sarah, was established by someone who then became mayor of Jerusalem, Uri Lupoliansky. They're colorblind. This is to help very sick children. This is also to help wounded. It doesn't matter whether you're secular or religious, but it's run completely by the ultra-Orthodox. So this idea, there's this concept of milut chasidim, gemacht, where you help your own. But that's sort of how the Bnei Brak and Mea Shearim economies run. You know, you're giving charity to one another. They're dirt poor, by the way. I mean, so you talk about disproportionate numbers of state resources going to the Haredi population. It is, but they're still dirt poor. I mean, I have an article in my head that I haven't written yet, but it's turn Bnei Brak into Brooklyn. You don't want to turn, you don't want to turn Bnei Brak into Beverly Hills. It won't happen. That's not what they want. That's not what we want. But turn it to Brooklyn, where you have a self-sufficient group that's not going to rely on state handouts because their state handouts aren't coming. So maybe not everybody works. I mean, there's this famous concept, right? You have the 12 tribes. There's Zvulun and Issachar, or two of Jacob's brothers. They did a deal, right? Zvulun his symbol is a ship, so he was a merchant. He'd go off and he'd make money, and he'd share the money he made with Issachar. So he's actually mentioned first because, but for his endeavors, Issachar wouldn't be able to learn Torah or do the things that, on a Pollyannic sort of self-actualization scale would rate a higher score. But I see that trend improving, but a lot more needs to happen, and it has to be done at the leadership level, and it has to start among the Haredi leadership. They're not going to listen to Naftali Bennett. They're not going to even listen to another really orthodox guy who doesn't have the gravitas to affect real change. Now, people don't want to be poor. People don't want to stay poor. So within the community itself, I think there's a recognition that these trends are running up against time. So I'm hopeful. What does that mean for the Israeli economy? It means the Israeli economy needs to keep pace. So the growth rates are respectable for an economy that's done this well. Israel's GDP last year, for the first time, crossed the $300 billion threshold. $300 billion. Per capita GDP is $38,000. That includes the Haredi, that includes the Arabs. Per capita GDP is higher than Japan's. It's close to England, close to France. It's higher than Japan's, it's higher than Spain's. It's amazing that it's able to do this, but you're going to have income inequalities. Now you can buy a Lexus, but not everybody can buy a Lexus. So are you better off when nobody can buy a Lexus, or when only 4% of the population can, or take these trips abroad? So people need to be mindful of that. The tax system in Israel was rationalized, but that also means that people get to keep more of their money, and they do things that are pretty ostentatious. You have apartments in Israel that cost tens of millions of dollars. You have real wealth. The country has been able to succeed in such a way that over the past 20 years, in addition to the million immigrants from the former Soviet Union, we have brought in hundreds of billions of dollars in foreign investment. The venture capital industry in Israel, private equity in Israel, went from 0 to second in the world. Israel raises more venture capital than England, Germany, and France combined. Wow. You've got 70 VC firms, including 14 multinational VC firms with major operations in Israel. Israel has a current account surplus. For the non-economists in the room, that means that instead of clamoring for every single Deutschmark or dollar that we can get through reparations and the sale of Israel bonds and modest exports, we're now a net export. We export more than we import. That's pretty amazing for a little country like Israel, right? We talked about this 2 weeks ago. Israel's exports are now close to 35% of their GDP. It was less than 10, 30 years ago. High tech accounts for 40% of Israel's exports. That's a big deal. Manufacturing, by the way, is over 90%. I mean, Israel manufactures that stuff. That includes the diamonds, that includes the pharmaceuticals. So it's not just high tech. And the high tech story shouldn't be overblown. It's very critical, but it employs only 10% of the Israeli workforce. So 90% of the people who are working in Israel are working in some other field, in some other industry. And it's an engine that really benefited from the peace dividend. And we talked about that. We talked about what a difference 93 and 94 made in the interests of the chaebols and the Kariatsus and multinationals to do business with Israel, in the interest of Indonesia and India and China and Japan to trade with Israel. But in the description of this class, I also refer to a lack of peace tax, right? So if you have peace, or there's a perception of peace, there's a dividend. You get a benefit for that, because this, I'll give you one little anecdote. When I worked on Coors IPO in 1995, you put together a prospectus. A prospectus is a description of the company to enable investors to know what they're getting. This is a description of the company. At the beginning, there's some risk factors. And if you look at Apple, what's the risk factor? Maybe no one will want to buy a cell phone anymore. Or maybe Samsung will develop some new device, or Google will develop some Android technology that's better or different. Those are the risk factors. Every single Israeli prospectus in the 1990s started off with risk factor. Israel is in the Middle East. The Middle East is a very dangerous place. Lots of bad stuff has happened in the Middle East. Lots of bad stuff can continue to happen in the Middle East. Be very careful if you buy our stuff and there's bad stuff. Don't sue us. It's a little bit more legalese than that, but every single prospectus of every single Israeli company that went public in the 1990s, 2000s started with that as a risk factor. It's still a risk factor. And again, every point can form the basis of a class in and of itself. BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions, gets a lot of airtime. And you'll have these academics, or you'll have the Presbyterian Church, or you'll have a school or a union agitating to divest from Israel. And thank God that hasn't really had an impact on the Israeli economy. And in the face, or as a reaction to boycotts, people have suggested boycotts. Tal Brody, who's the famous American who played for the Israeli national basketball team, became the head when they had the Intifada, the Al-Aqsa Intifada in 2002, 3, 4, and all this boycott started. They had a movement called Shopifada. So instead of boycotting Israel, go ahead. It's like a boycott. You go out and you try to buy things that are visibly Israeli. I keep a soda stream at home. I have one in my office. Separate discussion about how disproportionately the Arabs, Israeli Arabs, and also some Palestinian Arabs would be affected if some of these companies like Ahava and SodaStream, the ones they're specifically targeting, would be boycotted out of business. So I'm not worried about the current state of BDS as a threat, as a short or intermediate threat to Israel's economy, but I think that underappreciating the threat and the danger of these movements gaining traction is not helpful. Actually, I would say much more strongly that we need to be vigilant and we need to cut these things off before they gain oxygen, because there is this sense that it's cool and this is like kosher anti-Semitism in a way, and no anti-Semitism is kosher, and this strain of it is just as venal as any other. I mean, it's not as lethal, thank God, but the comparisons to South Africa are ridiculous. There are major ways that the lives of Arabs in Israel could be better. There are clear inequalities among Arabs and Jews in terms of access to certain positions and entitlement programs. Still certain criteria based upon military service. If you didn't serve, you don't qualify, and therefore you can't ascend. But that's true in this country too. I mean, if you look at this, anybody can make it. The likelihood that you will reach any stratum in the United States of America is pretty much determined at birth, unfortunately. That's true in this country, it's true in Canada, and increasingly it's also true in Israel. When you've got all these different strata, where you're born is going to be extremely determinative of where you wind up. And yet you want to promote ambition, you want to promote enterprise, and I think that the Israeli system is structured for that. But I'm concerned that if this boycott, divestment, sanction movement gets popular, and if relations between Israel and some of its major trading partners deteriorates, if there's, God forbid, a war and Israel is targeted and seen as maybe overreacting, or you have certain humanitarian crises, and that's why the Israelis get it. I think Israelis are very vigilant to make sure that all these ascendant attempts to be part of the ICE, the International Criminal Court, and other insidious ways of castigating Israel in so many different international fora, we're pretty good. I mean, I don't know, once we get there, I don't know if we're as successful as we'd like to be, but we certainly have our pulse on the initiatives that are taking place to stymie Israel's inclusion on the global political stage. Thank God Israel's inclusion on the global economic stage is today, as we stand here, February 13th, Friday 13th, 2015, is unprecedented. It's never been this good. And yet, the domestic issues need to be addressed. And we now have an opportunity to do it. I talked about social cohesion being a national security interest. I talked about how important food independence is. Israel, for the first time ever, has energy independence. It's huge. Yeah. Think about it. Israel, the natural gas discoveries offshore, and people call them a game changer. They're not just a game changer economically, they're a game changer politically, they're a game changer strategically, they're a game changer militarily. Israel now has enough water because of all the desalination plants. I mean, we remember songs about water and praying for rain, and in the 50s and 60s, and you had 1/10 the population. And water was such a scarce resource. And you had the Mobil Aretzi, the national carrier, from the Kinneret, from the Sea of Galilee down to the Negev to enable sort of Ben Gurion's dream of population dispersion. Then they started tapping into the underground aquifers and political disputes of whether this is West Bank water or East Bank, Sumerian water. Israel solved its water problem with a population that's 12 times higher than it was at inception. That's a pretty big deal. So Israel's a net exporter of water. For those of you who knew how much cotton and bananas Israel exported for years and years, I think it's been an exporter of water for decades, but now it's real water to Jordan. I mean, Jordan is the largest recipient of water from Israel, and there are not going to be any more wars fought over water. I mean, before the Six-Day War, Israel and Syria were going after it all the time because of who controlled, the Dan Chatzbani and the Banyas feeding into the Galilee. So I'm going to cut off and leave some time for questions, but just to weave all this in together, I think that we can all be proud that at various steps along the way, anything we did to help Israel when it didn't have an A+ credit rating in the international bond markets, when it didn't have access to foreign reserves, when there wasn't a McDonald's, when you couldn't buy Adidas, when the only foreign Japanese car was a Subaru, we certainly did our part to help Israel get to where it is right now, which is a great place. But I think getting sanguine about this place and assuming that it's not at all vulnerable would be a disservice. So we should be proud of the resilience of the Israeli economy, but we shouldn't take it for granted. Thank you.
I enjoyed your lecture, but I go to Israel every year. And my friends are concerned about one thing.
I'll repeat the question.
They're concerned that 50% of the children in the kindergartens in the first grade are Haredim and Arabs. Who's going to go to the army in 13 years?
Well, that's a great question, and we talked about it the question is that 50% of the first graders in Israel are a combination of Haredi and Arabs. They're obviously in very different schools, but the one thing they share in common is that they're not going to be joining the armed forces 13 years from now. So my answer to that is, they should have more kids to balance it out. So, but that's cynical. Two things. One, the military is less dependent today on the numbers of soldiers in it. So it's become much more of a qualitative analysis rather than a quantitative analysis, but you still need a standing army. If the reason for that was because the population was declining, I'd be much more concerned. But the good news is that the non-Haredi and non-Arab segments of the Israeli population are rising. And Israel's threats, the threats to Israel exist, and in many cases they're getting bigger. But the way to address those threats it's not clear that the most effective way is just to throw more soldiers at it. I think it's just a much more sophisticated way of contending with it. I think in terms of manpower, the IDF sometimes has a challenge in absorbing all the potential recruits that are coming on board. And if we do buy into this national service option, then the extent that these kids are properly educated and trained to work within their own communities and give the people who raise them a better future, then maybe that's not such a bad thing.
Tim Cook is going to be in Israel next week, and Apple's opening up a huge place there with 800 employees.
That's true. Hopefully with solar panels on the roof. Yes.
My son works for IBM, and they have several large facilities over there.
Yeah.
I was over there frequently. Just a couple of points. Number one, I have 6 grandchildren in Israel, a son and a daughter-in-law. They live on the West Bank in Efrat. He has told me that 75% of the wealth in the country is controlled by 5 families. Now that's pretty astounding for a quasi-socialistic country, number one. Number two, relative to the water, one of the ways that Israel has conserved its water is that they are now importing a lot of fruits and to grow. This is what my son told me, because he's very proud of living there. And in terms of what you're talking about with the Army, I go over with, I serve with the IDF, Volunteers for Israel, which has a group here. Anybody that's interested, speak to me after the thing. I go over once or twice a year, and I see that there are a lot of IDF soldiers that come to our base and sit around and do nothing. I think you're right that there's a lot of people in the Army, and because it has become so high-tech, and that they really don't know what to do with all the people they have.
Well, thank you for those comments, and kudos to your Zionism and expressed directly with your children, 6 grandchildren living in the country. So as far as the wealth inequality, I've said this before, about 82% of all statistics being made up. So I don't know if it's 75%, 5 families, or 50%, 10 families. There is a concentration of wealth. There are certain families, obviously, that have a lot. The Antitrust Authority in Israel is focused on this. We talked about the gas fields. So the Delek Noble Consortium is now being forced to add in additional partners, sell off some assets, so that you don't have that kind of control. As far as the water, I'll tell you where the real genius is, right? So we talked about energy before. The cheapest energy plant is one you don't have to build, right? So talk about conservation efficiency. Israel has 350 water companies, most of which are focused on water efficiency. Israel recycles over 70% of its industrial and agricultural water. Wow. The next highest country in the world is Spain, and they're at about 20%. In the United States, it's less than 3%. Wow. So that's really where that's really a game changer as far as water independence is concerned. You had your hand up.
Yeah. I wonder, what's the socioeconomic impact of communities like the ones in Beit Shemesh, which are populated largely by Talei Tshuva, mostly English speaking in the Sea of Hebrew?
Well, I mean, that's a very temporary challenge, and it's not even a challenge, it's an opportunity. So I think that you're talking about Bet Shemesh and not Ramat Bet Shemesh. I mean, they're next to each other, but they're completely different challenges.
Well, what I'm thinking of also is, from my own observation, typically these are very young people and they do receive a lot of financial support from their parents.
Well, that's great. I mean, to the extent that their parents are supportive of them having that kind of opportunity, I'm just applauded. I mean, look, I go back 20, 30 years, and certainly if you go back further, this would be even more true. If somebody decided to make Aliyah, to move to Israel from the United States or Canada, dude, you're a hero. You know, kudos for you for giving up what could be a very lucrative job at McKinsey or Goldman Sachs or any other endeavor they'd want to dredge the swamps or help this fledgling country get a little bit better in terms of the things it's trying to do. Today, those kids should be envied because they certainly have as much opportunity in Bet Shemesh and Ra'anana and Jerusalem as they would in Boca, Delray or Aventura, which is a lot of opportunity. I think this is a great place to live, and I think that's a great place to live. But I think the perception that there's necessarily going to be a socioeconomic hit at the expense of their, Zionism, that their ideology has a price, I think that price has disappeared. Yes?
Two questions also. One, you said that the approximate percentage or amount compared to the GDP, $38,000 per family. What was the GDP, I think, in Israel? My curiosity is, what's the average income of a family in Israel? Second question is, what percentage of the budget goes across the green line without labeling it in ways, especially for the social programs, including rent subsidies, vis-a-vis what's within the green line?
All right, so as far as your first question, what's the average income? I mean, the per capita GDP takes into account a lot of different factors, right? That's not necessarily money you put in your pocket. And there is, I can get back to you with a precise number, there is an increasing percentage of Israelis living under the poverty line. For the first time, perhaps, Israel's contending with a challenge of hunger. People were poor before, but that's a real issue, and I think could be addressed a lot better. As far as your second question, I don't know if you're asking me sort of politically to what extent is the Israeli government subsidizing settlements and housing benefits. Look, not that many people want to live there, so housing in and of itself is not very expensive. In Greater Jerusalem, right? We're talking about Ramat Shlomo, Har Choma. Those subsidies are part of a general trend to provide affordable housing for people who couldn't otherwise afford it. Now, cynically, one can say that why don't you build the affordable housing in the Galilee, right? I mean, there we're really running up against the demographic challenge. Over 50% of the Galilee and the Triangle is non-Jewish, right, between the Arabs and the Druze. So I think it's a healthy debate. I mean, you're building, some of it is security, some of it is convenience. Next to the housing, there's a lot of infrastructure that's being built on the other side of the Green Line. But to the extent that you have Israelis living there and going to work there, and there's a way to make their access to and from their homes safer by bypassing areas that have previously been launching points for bottles and bullets, then it's probably not a bad investment.
Yes.
This is speculation, but what do you think would happen if Labour wins the next election?
I'd rather save that for the next class, but
What was the question?
the question is, what do I think would happen if the Zionist camp, Hamachanat Tzionii is what they're calling themselves, the Bougie Herzog, Tzipi Livni coalition, I think Israel will hum along nicely. I think that if you're asking me politically, do I think that suddenly we're going to just take the whole country and give it to somebody else? No. Am I sort of concerned about what's happening visibly in the U.S.-Israel relationship? Yeah, we'll talk about that a lot next class. Do I think that this administration has a preference regarding the outcome of the election on March 17th? Yes, I do, but I also think that we still haven't seen anything as egregious as the president inviting either Herzog or Livni to the White House and traveling around the country to certain fundraisers for them to be able to expand their donor base, which is pretty much what Bibi did with Mitt Romney in 2012. So maybe what goes around comes around, but it's not pretty. But we'll talk about it on Friday. Yes?
How are the Ethiopian Jews doing in the country?
Excellent question. Thank you for asking. The question is, how are the Ethiopian Jews faring in Israel? So we talked about immigration both as a need and as an asset. Right? So you had these 750,000 Jews who came from, after the state of Israel, from Cyprus, from other detention camps, from the DP camps in Europe, some from America, mostly from Arab lands, where they were expelled or just realized that life would be extremely different after the establishment of the modern state. That was a need. I don't call it a liability, it was a need. It was something that needed to be taken care of, addressed. The Russian immigration, even though it required some resources and loan guarantees in order to facilitate their integration into Israeli society, quickly became much more of an asset. The Ethiopians, for the most part, remain in need. And I think that there's been an unimpressive record of getting them into the mainstream of Israeli society. And I think there are a lot of reasons for it. There's some cultural reasons on their end with leadership. I think this generation is doing better than the previous generation, so I find that extremely encouraging. The intermarriage rate is increasing, and so we're not completely colorblind yet, but we're more so than we were a generation ago. And you'll see some representation. So they're underrepresented. They're underrepresented in high tech. They're underrepresented in government. They're underrepresented in academia. But the emphases are changing. So I'm optimistic that the next generation will do better still.
Just as a joke, one did make Miss Israel.
Yeah, that's true. So so there you go. Yes, first you and you. Yes.
2 years ago.
I'm glad to see, according to your lecture, that the Israeli economy has boomed. I was just in Israel last week. I've noticed three things. Basic living conditions. One, food is very expensive. Two, gas is very expensive. And three, housing is impossible to get. Now, for an Israeli to buy a house, I can't see how they can be able to do it.
Yeah. So
What is your opinion?
So
How to improve this situation?
these are issues. I mean, on all points. So the food, gas is the same price everywhere you go. So you can't even do what you do here and shop around for a corner. You'll shave a few pennies per gallon, and it's very expensive because it's very heavily taxed. If you want my opinion, I think gas should be more expensive in the United States. I think that in Israel they got it right. I think here we're letting people drive their Hummers all over the place for relative to the rest of the world. Again, Venezuela being an exception, for free. So gas is expensive. It should be food. Food is expensive, but not everywhere. So if you go to the development towns, you're not paying 30 shekels for a box of cornflakes. But I don't know if so the basic food stuff is much more expensive in the larger cities and in the nicer neighborhoods. Housing, same deal. In other words, if you want to live in downtown Tel Aviv, if you want to live in most parts of Jerusalem, it's going to be expensive. If you want to live in the Galilee, if you want to live in the Negev, if you want to live in many other parts of the country, you can you can do pretty well. If you want to live in Midtown Manhattan, housing there is outrageous. If you want to live on the beach, housing is pretty expensive. And I'm not saying that it isn't a problem. I don't want to give a dismissive response to a very important issue. We're trying to get more affordable housing. There's a big tax now. If you're not living in Israel and you want to buy an apartment anywhere in Israel, but this is more relevant in Jerusalem, Netanya, and Herzliya and Tel Aviv, because people talk about the French Jews, but the French Jews and the American Jews. I own an apartment in Israel, or someone else in this room that has 2 apartments in Israel. Many other people here may have an apartment in Israel. The government doesn't mind. They like the fact that this is foreign investment, but they're going to make it a little bit more expensive for us relative to people who need those apartments to live in full time. But I think that's a blip, that there's a lot more that could be done. Yes?
Just on, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I'll take these 2 and then we'll...
Thank you. What is the impact, socioeconomic impact of the Bedouin and the Druze? And further to that, I know that the government is doing some things to resettle some of the Bedouin from their whatever you call it, but to some resistance. But what in general would be the impact?
Well, if you're asking what would be the impact of solving that?
Like, where do they sit with, the economy, in the economy, how much is subsidized relatively?
So it's
to the other,
2 completely different populations,
Right.
2 completely different sets of challenges. So I'll start with the Druze because that's easy. So the Druze historically have always been the easiest non-Jewish sector of the population, served and continue to serve proudly in the army, in the police force. When you had the murder of the four rabbis in Har Nof, the first responder who himself was also killed in the attack was a Druze border patrol policeman, and they've distinguished.
Contribution to the country in terms of jobs and or
So they're part of the
their
workforce.
opportunities.
They're part of the workforce. So what I said about Christian Arabs applies equally to Druze. I mean, they're not Christian, but they never felt displaced. Like it wasn't this. They also don't think, and they weren't led to think. Their leadership didn't sort of inculcate them with a sense of deprived nationalism. Right? So they have their cousins in Syria. They tend to be congregated in the northern part of the Israel, in the Carmel and the Golan Heights, and for the most part, they've been effective and cherished participants in the Israeli society, Israeli economy, and what's his name? Salim Jubrun is a justice on the Israeli Supreme Court. The deputy speaker of the Knesset is Druze. So we have a lot of things to be proud of as far as the relationship with the Druze. I mean, I think it's a paradigm for how we could interact with some of the other sectors. The Bedouin are not. The Bedouin, unfortunately, and I mentioned my role with McGill University, they tend disproportionately to live in the southern part of the country. They certainly don't play by our rules. They did serve in the IDF in more meaningful numbers. Now they pretty much have stopped serving in the IDF. It was always volunteer for them and the Druze. The Druze, Bedouin don't get conscripted. They can volunteer. The Bedouin would, as you may imagine, serve more like they were trackers and doing other things that reflected a skill set that was natural to them. But now the incidence of crime among the Bedouin is unprecedented. They're building wherever they want, doing whatever they want. They're taking over villages. You wouldn't want to drive around these places. I mean, they remind me a little bit of the banlieue, the suburbs in Paris, where the police dare not tread. There's some modest things that are being done to make it better. So that again, any Bedouin who wants to go to university goes to university. You walk around Ben Gurion's campus, we have 900 of them. Literally, that's a lot out of a student body of 16,000. And other universities take in Bedouin students as well. But they're not, they get paid to go to school, but they're not performing because they're launched into an academic experience